Welcome everyone to the Greeny Deal podcast, part of your favourite environmental platform, GND Media. I'm Adam Williams and here today with half man, half mixing deck, Andrew Glassford. How are you, matey?
Very well, man. Very well. I've had a wonderful weekend celebrating the coronation of a new overlord. Have you enjoyed being put under the boot this weekend?
What's that then? I don't know what you're talking about, mate.
Oh, I think some guy had a hat put on him yesterday.
Did they?
Yeah. I hear it's a very expensive hat.
Is it?
Incredibly expensive hat. That
And
may be covered in lots of blood diamonds.
Do you know what? I knew there was a reason why I didn't go out this weekend and close my curtains and didn't watch the telly. That's what it was. Yeah. So did that go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to. Well, me and some people went down there to just show our displeasure, but we got locked up once we entered the M25. So,
right,
but lovely weekend, great for the family. Either way, no problems
just
at all.
Just an average, normal day on the British side.
Just Christian's face while we're talking about this is brilliant.
Anyway, good to see you, though, mate.
Yeah, man.
Okay, so a little while ago, we had the author of A Blue New Deal on the show, Christopher Armstrong, who highlighted how we often neglect the Earth's oceans when it comes to the climate crisis. After the show, I said to Chris that I wanted to make sure that as a platform, we did all we could to put a spotlight on the oceans to keep it in the public's mind. Chris has since written for us regarding the latest global high seas treaty, which we will link to the show, but he also told me about a book that he'd read that explored the concepts of sustainable shipping. The book is called Trade Winds and is a real-life account of a crew that embarked on a traditional wind propulsion sailing trip to export goods across the Atlantic. But whilst out at sea, the COVID pandemic struck. What was initially supposed to be a 3-week trip turned into a 5-month journey. It's a fascinating book about the shipping industry as a whole, the stress of being at sea for so long, the personal dynamics between the shipmates, and the challenges of making the shipping industry fit for purpose in the face of climate breakdown. On today's show, I'm delighted that one of the crew members and the author of the book, Christiaan De Beukelaer, is here to tell us about such a unique and important experience. Christiaan, welcome to the show, mate.
Oh, thank you very much, Adam and Andrew.
Thanks so much for being on the show. Okay, Christiaan, please tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and could you give us the initial context of your journey, which, as I said, was meant to last around 3 weeks?
So I'm an academic. I work at the University of Melbourne, and when I moved to Melbourne, I was living in Edinburgh at the time, and when I moved down here, I figured that I wanted to do something to kind of get out of the office on weekends and make sure that I enjoyed life a bit more, because we academics are kind of known to be, in the books all the time, and we very much live for work, and I wanted to get a bit more life in my life. So I started sailing on every Saturday and thought, oh, this is lovely. How can I do more of it? Well, obviously by turning it into work. But at the same time, I was also, I knew that for over 10 years already, there was a group of, some call them lunatics, some call them visionaries, but some sailors in the Netherlands who had been operating a vessel called the Tres Hombres to transport goods across the sea using wind propulsion. And I kind of just put 2 and 2 together and thought, well, if I can go sailing for field work, and if I can actually potentially contribute to, moving the dial on the climate action, or at the time inaction of the shipping industry, then that's definitely a win-win. So I started looking into that and signed on as a kind of trainee crew on the Aventure, another such ship operated by a German company called Timber Coast. Yeah, my plan was basically to spend a simple Atlantic crossing from Tenerife to Marie-Galante in Guadeloupe, the French Antilles, early in the year, beautiful weather, kind of nice breeze, nice company, couple of weeks at sea. I thought, this is going to be nice. And it was, but it just took way longer than 3 weeks because, while we were at sea, all of a sudden, all borders shut and, we weren't allowed to go ashore anymore.
So you just mentioned the vessel you're on was called the Aventure. I imagine most people listening to this will have very little knowledge about what life is like at sea, let alone life is like on a sail cargo ship. Can you kind of describe those 6 months? I know obviously that's most of the content of the book, but you kind of set out in a very kind of optimistic way, the the economics of sail cargo is quite different to the economics of giant scale shipping containers. And as far as I'm aware, like everyone on the Aventure is like a volunteer. Is that the case? So can you kind of like lay that out for us a bit, what life was like on the Aventure?
So on the Aventure, we were 15 in total, and I was one of them. 7 of the people on board were paid crew members.
Right.
We had the captain, the first and second officer, the bosun, the cook, and 2 deckhands. And they were all kind of, qualified professionals who had quite some sea time behind them, and who knew what they were doing and signed on, to earn a living. Yeah. The 8 remaining, myself included, were so-called voyage crew or trainees.
Right.
And in that sense, the ship operated quite similar to a sail training vessel,
right,
where you have a skeleton crew who, if it comes down to it, can sail the ship on their own. And then you have, trainees who learn the ropes, but who are also extremely useful, when things go well and when, we're just sailing the ship day in, day out. And what happens is that when you come on board a sailing ship, and this is, a very kind of old tradition that's carried over hundreds, if not thousands of years of seafaring, is that you get assigned to a watch.
Yeah.
And that watch becomes your life on board, because you have periods that you're on and you have periods that you're off. But when you're on watch, you are expected to be on deck or to, be doing something in function of, steering, operating, maintaining, cleaning, cooking, doing the dishes, whatever it is, you're busy. And we were on watch 4 hours on and then 8 hours off, where basically you have, 2 periods of 4 hours that you're working, and then you have something less than 8 hours that you're actually off, because there's always, watch changeover and you have to eat and there's things that you have to do. So you have a short night and then you have some time to rest during the day as well. And of course, because ships operate 24/7, it means no weekends. And it means that there's always someone at work. There's always an entire watch on deck looking after the ship. And that's actually a really kind of, it defines the cadence, the pace, the everything of the ship. Because you know that, when you're tossing and turning at night because the weather is rough, I can't sleep really well, but my shipmates are up there in the cold, in the rain, in the heat, whatever it is, and they're actually sailing the ship. And this is like one of the, minor things that you might not think of if you're not a sailor, but you don't set your alarm ever. No one has an alarm.
Right.
Because you get woken up by the previous watch. The standing watch comes down, wakes you up in time, so you have half an hour to get dressed, to brush your teeth, have breakfast before you take over the watch yourself. So that's really that kind of daily movement, that routine that becomes so central to your days. So on the one hand, you've got these extremely rigid time blocks, because if you're late, the previous watch can't go below deck and rest. So your time in those 4-hour blocks is extremely rigid. But then apart from that, you have no idea what day of the week it is, what month it is. And that kind of contrast of, that very different kind of rigidity and fluidity of time really, for me, defines what life at sea really is.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I often find when I'm off work for 2 weeks, because you get like 2 weeks blocks, once a year, you can often forget what day of the week it is. So I wonder if it's just tied to work itself, which is quite interesting. Now, Christiaan, early in the book, you quote Foucault, who said that the boat is a floating piece of space which exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea. Can you explain what is meant by this and how it related to your experience?
Yeah, so this is the idea of the kind of the French philosopher who kind of referred to the ship as the ultimate other place, kind of, because we think of the land and the social structures we inhabit as being quite fixed, and it's sometimes kind of difficult to imagine an alternative to that. And he wrote this essay called Des Espaces Autres, or kind of so of other places, in which he speaks of heterotopia, literally other places, in contrast to the kind of more dystopian and utopian ways of looking at the world. And it's quite useful to imagine other places as being an inspiration, as being a zone of experimentation. In that context, he referred to the ship as a place where that kind of, experimentation is possible in a way. And I found that argument quite instructive because, to some extent, I agree, and to some extent, I kind of question his understanding of what life at sea is really like. Because, yes, it is another space where things are done, quite differently.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's not some sort of space in which you can just do whatever you want, because on the one hand, safety is paramount. Because if the ship goes down, everyone is dead, unless you've got life, Anyway, it's not safe to drown. Let's put it that way. Or it's not safe to sink. Let's not go through all the possible scenarios. But basically, that is one thing, safety. And the other thing is that because of the way seafaring culture works, is that you've got a whole set of rules and hierarchies that have been developed and refined over thousands of years of seafaring, meaning that you basically live in a dictatorship where hopefully your captain is a benevolent dictator. So in that sense, it's a kind of experience that you would otherwise never have. You wholly have to submit to the authority of the captain and the way in which they run that ship, because otherwise it's not going to work. And in that sense, the kind of community that you build once you kind of leave port is a community that exists only then and there with those people who are on board at that point in time. Even if all the same people would come back to the same vessel, it would still be a different community. And that kind of unique space that you are stuck with each other for better and for worse. You make something out of it, and that allows you to kind of experiment socially in terms of how you relate to each other and what kind of shipboard community that you want to be.
Do you think that kind of plays out on the kind of larger container ships and like cruise liners and stuff, where there is more, I suppose, for a better phrase, like luxury to the experience, as opposed to how you guys were living in bunks that were like, 60 centimeters deep and in these 4-hour watches? Is it the hardship that you go through and the kind of contact to the dangers of the sea being more apparent on a sailboat versus being on a huge ship? Does that play into it as well?
My experience is very much limited to sailing vessels of all sizes, and I haven't actually spent any time on board a major big kind of cargo ship at sea. So I find the comparison difficult to make. Yeah. But what I can say is that the one very significant difference is the amount of space that a seafarer would have on a large container or bulk carrying ship, because they would have their own cabin, which is entirely private to just them. But also the ship itself would on average be significantly larger, meaning that even if they're all on deck chipping rust or painting, they wouldn't necessarily be in direct close contact.
Right. Yeah.
Even so, you still have a kind of sense that you are there with each other. You're in a very closed community. There's only, there are few ships, and cruise ships are obviously the exception, but in terms of cargo ships, very few have more than 20 or 25 people on board. So it's all very, very closed. You have a very different way of interacting. There is one thing that is changing a lot of that, and whether you like him or not, Elon Musk is actually, a really big part of that change, because up until quite recently, not many cargo ships had unlimited internet for all their crews because it was very expensive.
Okay.
The really rich, big shipping companies would offer internet, but it would often be quite slow and not always very reliable. But Starlink Maritime seems to be really changing that. I haven't used it at sea myself, but I've heard some accounts of people saying, "Oh, everyone can use Netflix, and we can stream all the data of the ship directly to head office." And that idea that when you're at sea, you're offline, which was very much part of our experience, is something that will very soon be history. So in that sense, I was actually really happy that we were offline, because whenever we came into port, it was very obvious that everyone kind of gravitated towards their screens. Everyone was checking up with family and friends and the news, which was understandable. We were in a pandemic, and we had been at sea for weeks on end. But even so, the vibe on board changed the second that we were in reach of a phone mast or some other way of connecting to the internet immediately.
Christiaan, I'd like to move on now to like the scale of the issue in your book around the shipping industry. Now, you write that in 1887, seaborne trade totaled 137 million tons. It was 500,000 tons in 1950. And as of 2019, it is 11 billion tons. And you also write that it is expected to grow threefold by 2050. Now, that's some increase, isn't it?
It's absolutely mind-boggling how much that has increased.
And obviously, with this as a backdrop, tell us more about the idea around wind propulsion sailing as a form of importing and exporting cargo.
The idea of returning to wind propulsion is, like many ideas, deceptively simple. The idea is we've used sailing ships for thousands of years before we invented, the steam engine. And for all those thousands of years, we were able to ship goods, people, connect places in a way that, didn't burn any fossil fuels because we didn't have the technology to do that. And obviously, shipping volumes were a lot smaller, and a lot of the things that we did ship weren't exactly things that we should be proud of, because that's of course the real growth in maritime trade. Really, particularly if you look at European history, is very deeply connected to colonialism, to trade in enslaved human beings, and so on. So that's not something that we don't necessarily kind of want to make sailing great again in that sense, and kind of go back to that kind of mythical time when all things were great. To really sketch what the actual problem is with shipping, we should probably look back at the year 2018. And 2018 is the year in which the International Maritime Organization, or at least its member states, finally agreed on a greenhouse gas emissions reductions target. That's 5 years ago that the shipping industry finally woke up to the fact that they too should take action on climate change. That's 5 years ago. That's 21 years after the Kyoto Protocol, who asked the IMO to do exactly that. So that's just to give you an idea of kind of how late shipping has actually started taking this issue seriously. And a big part of the problem was that a lot of people in shipping thought it can't be done.
Right.
We have created an industry that runs on heavy fuel oil, some ships on LNG, but basically, if we don't have fossil fuels, we can't ship goods. If we can't ship goods, we can't have global capitalism. Ergo, we have to keep burning fuel. And then some people said, yeah, but what about sales? And do we even need global capitalism? And that's, of course, when things started getting interesting, because they kind of combined it. And they said, well, maybe we can trade differently, both in terms of the how we physically ship things, by returning to sale and kind of, yes, maybe, have some delays once in a while because, the wind drops out, or, run ships that have much less cargo carrying capacity. But at the same time, what they also started doing is wonder whether we should really be shipping 11 billion tons of goods every year. And if it's really a good idea to pretend that the shipping industry is merely a servant of trade. Because that's the kind of the dominant logic in maritime economics is shipping is a derived demand.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah, that's what they say. That's kind of the excuse, and we grow when economies grow, and then obviously they probably say, well, we would shrink if economies shrinked, but it's kind of like how do you get out of that? What do you say to that?
I say to that, look, it's unlikely that shipping is just a derived demand. Granted, some people get on the train because they want to look out of the window and see the scenery. So in that sense, personal transport is not only a derived demand in function of people needing to go from A to B for other reasons, as in people commute because they have to get to work. They don't go to work,
because they have to commute
by car in the metro because they feel like commuting. So, and in the same way, you could argue that no one would ship a container halfway across the world just for the fun of it.
Yeah.
It's because they have
it's cheaper.
Something to transport from point A to point B, and that transporting from point A to B is the trading that they're involved in. So you trade, and in order to complete the trade, you need to transport, and that's why it's derived demand. And up to a certain extent, that argument holds, but it doesn't entirely, because a lot of what we ship today would not be shipped if we didn't have container ships, if we hadn't invented the container. Because it wouldn't make sense to use stevedores to laboriously put every single pair of jeans one by one or bale by bale into a massive ship on the docks. It would kind of undo a lot more of the profits that you can now make by having those jeans produced in a country where salaries are very low.
Yeah.
And social protections are almost non-existent, and environmental regulations are, very, very limited as well. So in that sense,
it's about chasing profit, really, isn't
because
it? It's about chasing profit, isn't it? Essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But basically, the shipping is transporting capital. It's exploiting the idea that you can have something produced cheaply somewhere and then sell it expensively somewhere else. And that idea, that exploitation of the wage differential and the creation of artificial scarcity that comes with that is very much part of the kind of global economy that has been made possible through shipping. So saying that shipping is merely responding to that demand is not entirely correct. It enabled that kind of economy, and in turn, that kind of economy then really requires shipping to continue and to keep on growing. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way in which we could organize, the world. Because would we have the same kind of division of labor globally if salaries were similar everywhere?
I imagine not.
And I think that's part of the thing, because we have these cases where the absolute ridiculousness of shipping kind of becomes clear, where you've got people in Scotland go out fishing on their fishing boat, bring in the hull, frozen in the hull, because it's so expensive to clean it in Scotland, because people get paid, reasonably decent wages. It gets shipped off frozen halfway across the world, defrosted, cleaned, frozen again, and then sold in the supermarkets, probably not too far from where it was caught. And that is something that you probably wouldn't do if you'd have to pay that person cleaning the fish in Vietnam or in China the same wage as you would if they lived in Inverness. And so that's very much a part of that question of how much do we ship because it helps make an easy profit, and how much do we ship because it actually moves a good from where it exists to where it couldn't have otherwise existed. And this is where those sail cargo companies use the very kind of same logic as fair trade several decades ago. What are some of the things that we cannot grow in places like Europe where people really would like them? Chocolate, coffee, and other such goods would not grow in Europe. So you have to import them. Then how do you do that in a fair and nice way? And of course, it's quite easy to charge a premium for coffee or for chocolate, but it becomes a lot more difficult when you're dealing with, everyday goods that you simply do not want to pay a premium for.
Yeah, like wheat and...
If I need a new desk chair, I'm not sure if I would want to pay a premium to have it transported on a traditional sailing ship. But with coffee or chocolate, it's quite nice. And I think, but that's how, these sailing cargo companies kind of came in and said, this is something that we can practically do, compact cargoes, high value, and we can charge for this particular way of transporting it.
This might be a good opportunity for you to explain, I believe, Mission Zero, which kind of the Aventure and these other organizations are part of.
Yeah, so everyone I've come across and I've spoken to probably not everyone, but almost everyone involved in sail cargo in one way or another, all of them see that a ship that can transport 65 tons of cargo is not going to decarbonize the shipping industry. 65 versus 11 billion, that's not going to work. You'll need, tens, if not hundreds of millions of ships of that size in order to make that work. So the idea is that these small traditional sailing ships serve as a testing ground, as showing that there are still winds at sea. We can still harness them for maritime transport. And the idea is to use that as a kind of a proof of concept to then scale up and to invite the kind of incumbents of the shipping industry to harness wind power whenever and wherever they can as well, to cut their emissions. And that's something that you see happening. You have a few of these sail cargo companies are building larger and larger ships, and the conventional industry is increasingly taking the idea of wind propulsion seriously. But it is, it's speeding up, but it's still going at a snail's pace compared to, how fast it should be going.
So what is currently on the table in regards to the technology to get the industry to net zero? And also, do you want to explain the Jevons paradox, which you mentioned in your book a couple of times?
Yeah. First of all, the shipping industry should get to zero. not to net zero, because it is an industry that can technically get to zero. So when you start talking about net zero, lots of people get excited about offsets and kind of, creative accounting, and that's what we're trying to avoid. The only way in which we can speak of net zero in shipping is when looking at the life cycle of possible alternative fuels, because there will always be some need for a fuel. And the idea is there that we have to make sure that some fuels will absorb CO2 when they're created and emit it when they're at sea. So if you only look at what happens at sea, they would still be counted as emitting. But if you look at that whole life cycle, they would be zero. And that's what, proponents of a so-called well-to-wake approach to fuels in shipping look at with their life cycle approach, but they refer to it as that kind of life cycle rather than net zero. So, but that's a very technical remark. You're most welcome to cut that if you'd like to.
No, I think it's good. It's good.
Within that context, and I think before I get into the current state of sailing technology, I would like to point out that this year is an incredibly important year for the shipping industry, because I mentioned that the first real kind of target for the industry to cut its emissions was adopted 5 years ago. And the target there was to halve emissions between 2008 and 2050. And obviously, unless you haven't followed any IPCC reporting, that is nowhere nearly enough for shipping to play a fair role in cutting emissions in line with a 1.5 degree future. It is not at all 1.5. It's more closer to 3 degrees, which is not what we want. So this year, we are revising that strategy that was built into the initial strategy. But in July this year, IMO member states are meeting in London to adopt a revised strategy. And the hope is that that will be a zero target by 2050 with strong targets in the interim years, 2030, 2040. And some are even arguing that we need to go much faster than that. And those are the ones calling for science-based targets. And the call there is for, a reduction of 37 to 50% by 2030, so really hard, really fast, and 96 to 100% by 2040. And that's basically the scientific targets that we need to set and meet if shipping should play a proportionate role in keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming.
And these aren't binding, are they? It's like the IPC. It's like the what's the other one? The UN targets. They're like, you have to buy into it, but there's no real repercussion if you don't do it as well.
Well, so this is where things get interesting, because the IMO is a UN agency, but historically the IMO has been quite effective in setting global rules, because shipping is a global industry, and you can try to run a ship or a shipping industry that is, entirely domestic, and that's fine. Then you fall under the domestic emissions of that country. But if you have an international shipping company, you need a flag, you need insurance, you need classification societies, you need ports. And the ways in which the shipping industry is controlled, or is the way in which the rules are enforced, is that both flag states and port states can check whether or not ships are following the rules. And without a flag, you can't sail, and without a port, there's no point to sailing. So it kind of creates a patchwork that is kind of difficult to avoid scrutiny. So if we, and historically, if the IMO agrees on setting certain rules, then port state and flag state authorities will follow that, because otherwise they get into all kinds of trouble with other countries.
Yeah.
So it's in everyone's interest to create a level playing field for the entire shipping industry. And that's why they're so resistant to a very clear target, because once the target is there, the expectation is that it will be followed quite well.
Right, interesting.
But
so
that's the kind of the governance architecture, if you will. But the other thing is that there are proposals to actually put a price on greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, which means that would be the first ever industry that has a greenhouse gas price that is global. We have some regional things. We have the EU emissions trading scheme, and there are some other trading schemes and caps and carbon prices, but there isn't an industry where it is immediately global. Only aviation and shipping are organized in that way. And if there is that carbon price, then that will do two things. Well, three things really. One, it closes the gap with new technologies by making fossil fuels more expensive, the other ones relatively cheaper. It will speed up the process because it gives a very clear incentive to those technologies and adopting technologies that do not have any emissions. But also, it will raise an enormous amount of money.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I think this is one of the first times I've kind of understood like the regulatory state to actually be in a way that will work properly to have the outcomes you want or push it in the right direction, as opposed to there being, thousands of intricate loopholes around how stuff is legislated. Because as you say, if shipping and it's this kind of global sector requires there to be like a level playing field for the market to work entirely, then they're all going to have to adjust to it. So I'm not surprised it's taken 21 years to get that first target in 2018, because the people who are at the heads of that sector would understand that implicitly from what they were doing as well. You brought up, just to quickly go on to this, you brought up about there being flag states and port states. Has there been any attempts for people to utilize where their boats are registered versus where they're going in terms of getting around carbon regulations or these carbon targets?
The aim is to avoid that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough.
Because what you see is under normal climate negotiations, you'll have countries taking on different responsibilities based on the kind of country they are. So developing countries usually have a bit more leeway in continuing to emit, whereas rich countries a lot less so. Because ships can reflag theoretically overnight, the idea is that kind of a rule where countries are treated differently would be quite counterproductive in shipping. So the idea is that there would be one rule for everyone, meaning that it doesn't matter where your ship is registered or where you go, you will have to abide by the same rules. But the question is then, how do you ensure that doesn't, push the poorest people into deeper poverty? And that's where that idea of putting the price on carbon comes in, because currently carbon emissions are around 1 billion tons a year from shipping alone. If you put a price on that of $100, and that's what the Republic of the Marshall Islands has proposed, so $100 per ton of carbon or carbon equivalent raises about $100 billion a year in first instance until emissions start to drop. Incidentally, that's the same amount as was promised under the Green Climate Fund, or as part of the Paris Agreement. But obviously, we never really got to that 100 billion a year. But this would be a mechanism where that money would certainly in the first decade, that would be coming in. The question is then, what do you do with that? And there's a big discussion around, do we use that in industry to basically cross-subsidize new technologies and alternative fuels that are a lot more expensive? Do we allow for new port infrastructure or other kinds of climate adaptation and mitigation in especially developing countries, so they're ready for, more extreme weather and so on? Or do we actually, see this as some sort of a fund that can really engage with much broader kind of, aims and objectives aligned with, climate justice? And that's the real struggle that we see right now, that, some countries are not at all in favor of that latter proposal. Whereas, countries like the Marshall Islands say, well, we didn't cause this problem. We didn't emit all this carbon, but we're, barely above sea level, and we'll be the first to drown. So, please, why should we be the ones paying for this when you caused it?
Christiaan, towards the end of the book, which I think was really brave, you do put forward 5 proposals that you would like to see us to get out of this mess, really. And like I said, I do think that's brave, because often you read books that sort of, they talk about the issues, but they don't talk so much about the solutions. Now, it is a short passage, but could you just elaborate on those 5 proposals?
It's always a tricky thing to try to make proposals like this, because effectively you spend, 300 pages explaining how complex a problem is, and then you try to solve it in a few pages, which is basically delusional. And that's why I started out with the most delusional proposal. So I said, in first instance, why don't we actually start out by banning the transport of the most polluting things? And a very straightforward thing, and I drafted that section just after the COP in Glasgow, where we kind of, lukewarmly agreed to kind of phase out unabated coal. And that unabated was of course the crux of that commitment, completely taking out any power of it. But then I argued, why don't we stop shipping coal? Because fossil fuels alone account for 40% of the volume of cargo that is transported at sea every single year. But the bulk, about 2/3 of that, comes from Australia and Indonesia. And of course, those are 2 island states. You cannot export coal from Indonesia or Australia without shipping it, unless you air freight it, which would be
not great.
I'm not going to give anyone ideas, but that would be rather silly. So I put that out there as a first proposal, mainly flagging to kind of counter that idea that shipping is a mere handmaiden of trade, trying to illustrate that certain things could not be transported if it wasn't for ships. So maybe there is a moral responsibility to consider, what is possible there. The second argument that I make is that we should, very much put a price on emissions from shipping. And I think that is kind of a no-brainer, but it is something that, not everyone is on board with. And it's something that it would make shipping a bit more expensive in the short term. But importantly, and that's, the really important thing, because of that, it would speed up the transition and help pay for that transition a lot. So that's the second bit. The third is to really adopt wind propulsion whenever and wherever possible. And that whenever and wherever, that's not to quote Shakira, but to really kind of to immediately defuse a critique that often comes up is, yes, but X-type ship can't use wind, or this route is not good for wind, so it is not possible. It's just to say, whenever you can use it, wherever you can use it, use it.
Yeah.
Much like if you can cycle to work, then do it. Unless if it's really raining or whatever it is. But it's like, whenever and wherever, you can just do it. Because it's something that we can start using very quickly, because the technologies to retrofit existing ships exist, they work, and they may not save all the fuel, but 10% across the fleet is a lot, and 20% is an awful lot. So those kinds of savings really matter when we start scaling things up. And the fourth point is to really kind of think not just of how we're shipping, but also what we're shipping. Because we can be extremely wasteful in an efficient manner, but that would still be wasteful. Yeah. And I think that's what we're, doing with a lot of the kind of, the kind of consumerism on steroids is a lot of that. It's, getting the latest apps and the most efficient ways of buying things that you really do not need. And I'm not saying this to say, this doesn't mean that I'm vilifying individuals. I'm just saying, if we can build better goods, make sure that the toaster that you buy will last for 10, 20, 30 years rather than a year, that's great. Because then you need far, far fewer toasters over the course of your life. And that's how you consume less. Not by kind of saying that you can't have a toaster because it's bad for the environment. No, just make sure that you get one and keep it for a very long time. And of course, do that in a way that allows people who have never had a toaster in their life to also have one if they need one. What we can really do as a fifth and final point is to slow down and optimize what is actually being shipped. Because the fuel consumption of ships goes up almost exponentially when you kind of go over, when you increase the speed. And the idea is that, when the economy is overheated, ships go really, really fast, deliver all the goods as quickly as possible. But the thing is that environmentally, that's not efficient at all. What you kind of want is ships that go very slowly and steadily, arrive nicely on time when they're scheduled, but it could take a little bit longer. And that way, you already save an awful lot. And similarly, some researchers have found that even organizing the logistics chains more efficiently by just doing the inventories and by kind of arranging the movement of goods more efficiently could save more than a third of emissions. So those kinds of savings are absolute no-brainers. And if we can't start doing those, then there's little point that we start kind of, adopting the, really expensive alternative fuels. So that's the idea. Is I started out with an absolutely provocative idea and kind of worked down to things that are actually very feasible and realistic and quite easy to do and should be done, I argue.
I think me and Ads would agree that because of our slipping timescales, the more provocative the better at the moment, I think. I just want to kind of wrap up with one final question, which your book doesn't just outline how, we should all go back to sail cargo and there's no problems inherent in that. I'm just going to read this little quote that you put in there, as I think kind of illustrates some of the problems with sailing. You say, "I loathe the glorification of labour. I find myself far more aligned with the French-Cuban Marxist author Paul Lafargue, who wrote, the machine is the saviour of humanity. God shall redeem man from sordid arts, from the work for hire. God shall give him leisure and liberty." And as someone who spent a little bit of time on a sailboat, it's a hell of a lot of work and is like the opposite of what people would imagine the future would be like in certain ways. It requires a lot of, personal energy to be kind of keeping the ship going and to make sure you get to all these places on time and make sure that you don't die at sea if the weather turns badly. There's a bit of a thread of this kind of glorification of going back to simpler ways which don't require technology, I think, like in the kind of degrowth movement and anti-capitalism. How do you square those circles with moving back to sailing? Is it a case of, in a perfect world, there would be less demand, so there'd need to be less work, and so in aggregate it would be less work overall on people? Or is it kind of a friction that you've not worked out yet?
Well, it's a tricky one, and I don't think I've completely worked it out yet. But you've got like the extremes in a sense, right? You've got like the really kind of hardcore dark mountain kind of degrowth, kind of like really hardcore kind of stuff. Like, you just live in a cabin, chop your wood in the morning, and kind of just use that to heat your tea and coffee, and you just kill your chooks and then eat them for dinner and that kind of stuff. And then you have the whole luxury, fully automated kind of communism kind of, yes, we can have all the luxury, and yes, we can have it for everyone. And no, we don't have to compromise on any of that. And I'm not particularly attracted to either of them. And the term that I kind of quite like is one that I kind of picked up on in a Guy Standing's book on the Blue Commons, because he kind of speaks of the appeal of frugal abundance in contrast to the kind of artificial scarcity that is so inherent to kind of capitalist consumerism, and the idea that we can have abundance in combination with a certain kind of frugality seems like an interesting, and to me at least, appealing balance between that kind of everything for everyone and return to some sort of nature, primal state of being. And I think if both in material terms but also psychologically, if we want less, then we'll be happier more quickly. And because that's also it's kind of the philosophy that I've tried to live by for a very long time by now, is if you want less than you have, then you always have enough.
Yeah, I take that. I take that.
And if you always want more than you have, then you'll never have enough. And I think it's a lot of this is very much psychological in thinking, do I need this? No, because I have enough. And it's easy for me to say that because I do have enough. Yeah. And I really want to, what I hope is to be able to contribute to a shift where everyone can say that and say that and mean it.
We interviewed an IPCC contributor called Yamina Saheb, and she proposed the word sufficiency to be put into the IPCC for the first time. And I think that concept, sufficiency, is an absolutely fantastic concept. It's sort of like it's an abundance of the things that we need, very similar to what you've just said then. So I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but also as well, just for the sake of our audience, and I know it's a little bit at the moment, it's a little bit of a tinderbox, but when you sort of class the dark mountain philosophy as an extreme degrowth, just for our audience and just for those people involved in degrowth, I'm not sure if that's considered to be a degrowth philosophy. So perhaps we might just want to let's just forget that sort of comparison. There is the dark mountain and there is obviously the luxury communism, but where degrowth fits into that, I'm not sure they're on that extreme. So just wanted to point that out. But also, more importantly though, did you know about the sufficiency concept in the latest IPCC report?
Yeah, I'm very well across of that, and I think that's a great way of actually kind of capturing what degrowth scholars and activists are really calling for, because it captures the not the fears of people, but it actually points out what it should be for everyone, or what it could be for everyone. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that Dark Mountain is not part of the kind of degrowth logic. It's way beyond that. It's a very different way of looking at the future. So that's I appreciate that clarification, because that's quite a bit more extreme.
Yeah, no problem at all. But yeah, so listen, Christiaan, you've been a fantastic guest today. And you know what? I think that's a great way to end, because I think that sort of sufficiency concept is what we're really trying to get towards, all of us in a way. And I hope that might be a sort of a bringing together of a few philosophies, that one. But Christiaan, thank you so much. You've been a fantastic guest, and what a fantastic journey. I really recommend the book to people. We've only really touched the surface of it, so there's a hell of a lot more to delve into. So I highly recommend it, and thank you so much, Christiaan.
Well, my pleasure.
Okay, this is the part of the show that's dedicated to the fighters, the healers, and the conservers of the world that are doing their bit for all of us. The shout out. Christiaan, who would you like to give a shout out this week?
I'd like to give a shout out to Alson Keelan. And Alson is, he's a shipbuilder and he's a navigator from the Marshall Islands. And I was fortunate enough to meet him when I was in the Marshall Islands in April this year. And what he's been doing is, very, very closely aligned to the issues that I've been looking at, in that he went out and learned the long way and the hard way how to build outrigger canoes in the traditional Marshallese way. And he's then started working as a shipbuilder with communities of outer atolls of the Marshall Islands to build vessels that are fit for purpose, fit for their needs. So they build, vessels to transport people, to go out fishing, to transport goods, in order to make sure that, people on those atolls are able to go from one place to another. Because fuel is very expensive. And of course, we're trying to get, stop using it. And it's really fantastic to see how Alson Keelan is really building that community, responding to real needs, and doing that while teaching the people he's working with the craft of boat building so they can build more, maintain them, and slowly kind of, keep sailing.
Amazing.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay, and a big thank you to everyone that is listening. And remember, if you're helping the planet in any way, we love you, we appreciate you, and we hope you join us again next time. Take care, everybody.
Bye. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, with a special shout out to Lizzie, Jill Burke, Kaylee Woods Hartley, and Guillermont. If you'd like to join these amazing people and support the show, head to patreon.com/GND Media UK. And if you can't afford to help us out, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much.